Welcome everybody to this evening's conversation. My name is Tanya Filer and I'm the founder of StateUp, the advisory and insights firm focused on bridging the gap between the worlds of government and technology with the aim of improving citizens' lives. And I'm really pleased to be moderating the conversation this evening. We started the Digital Translators series last month with the aim of improving the quality of conversation at the intersection of government and technology, which seems to us more critical than ever. And what we really want to do in this series is move beyond some of the fairly negative examples at this juncture, from algorithmic decision-making fiascos of late to troubles with contact tracing. And instead, what we want to do is seek out and learn from individuals and organizations that are really helping to move the needle, I think, in a positive direction. And in a moment, I will introduce our speakers, who I think very much, each in their own way, embodies that spirit. We also, of course, want to ask what more needs to be done to ensure our governments and technology sectors and experts around the world are well placed both to converse with and crucially work with each other. And so I really hope that this series will contribute in some way to that effort. We are delighted to be partnering for this webinar with the Centre for Science and Policy at the University of Cambridge. And many of you will already know that CSAP does an absolutely outstanding and rather unique job, I think, of brokering conversations at the intersection of research and policy. And in a moment, I will hand over to Nikki Buckley, who is Associate Director of CSAP, to tell you just a little bit more about their work. I do just quickly want to run through a few housekeeping items. The first is just to note that we will be recording today's conversation, just for your awareness. Second, if you have a question, please do write it in the chat function, and we will try to come to at least some of you to share your questions and comments directly with the panel when we come to questions and answers. I know there are a lot of people joining today with very relevant perspectives to bring to this conversation, so I look forward to including you. Finally, also to note that we do have a Twitter hashtag for this webinar, which is Digital Translators, and it is in the chat. So do feel free, please, also to join the conversation on that channel. So without further ado, let me now hand over to Nikki Buckley to say a few words.
Thank you, Tanya. It's a pleasure for the Centre for Science and Policy to partner with StateUp on this event. So just to say a few more words about who we are. We were founded at the University of Cambridge 10 years ago as a knowledge brokerage organisation, and we operate a policy demand-led model. Our mission is to improve public policy through the more effective use of academic expertise. And the way we set about doing this is to go out there and find policymakers who've got questions to bring to the academy and operate a policy fellowship program. So every year we bring in about 36 policymakers who are from UK government, sometimes international, from learned societies, sometimes from the private sector, sometimes from the third sector. And we operate sort of competitive program to match 12 policymakers each term with academics at Cambridge across a really wide range of disciplines. So someone like Tanya has been a great person in our network, meeting policy fellows and really responding to their questions in this spirit of knowledge exchange. So we really believe that both academic research and public policy can proceed more effectively and achieve more benefit for people if this knowledge exchange mechanisms are working, and we've got a mechanism for bringing questions, contemporary, up-to-the-minute, challenging questions into the academy, and then getting a range of disciplinary inputs. So each of our policy fellows will meet about 25 researchers, and often digital data topics come up. We have cybersecurity topics, GovTech questions, use of data science in government, privacy enhancing technologies, whole range of things. And typically we would then be matching people for 1 hour conversations with people in the computer science department, in the business school, in engineering, in social science, in law, in public policy, and so on. And through that network, over 400 people have done the policy fellowship over the last 10 years. and also a cohort of policy leaders fellows from the senior UK civil service. From the back of that, we have arranged a whole range of policy workshops and roundtables, also some training events for both early career policymakers and early career researchers. And it's just such a stimulating field to work into, see the questions that are coming forward, and then arrange a wide range of academics to make a contribution. We are based at Cambridge University, but work with partners right across the UK and beyond. So we have a number of academics at other universities who we are also connecting people to, as well as companies in the Cambridge cluster. We are part of a new collaboration with 4 other UK universities who are doing this sort of thing as well. So increasingly working with UCL, Manchester, Nottingham, Northumbria and others. And really just to encourage people on the call, if you're interested in what we're doing, have a look at our website, which is csap.cam.ac.uk. Have a look at maybe the Policy Fellowship Programme and our events, and we're running webinars and podcasts at the moment. But I really feel that it's through discussions like this with people from different sectors that, you know, the best research can progress and impact for public policy. And we're really pleased that one of our policy fellows is on the panel this evening, Michael McDonald, so you'll hear from him a bit later. Thanks, Tanya.
Thank you, Nikki, and I'm sure Michael will fly the flag for CSAP as well. It's a pleasure to be partnering with CSAP, as I say. Now I'm delighted to introduce our panelists for the discussion today, who I think really bring a unique range of experiences and perspectives from across sectors to this question of the intersection between government and technology. So we're joined by Ciaran Martin, who's Professor of Practice in the Management of Public Organisations at the University of Oxford, and former CEO of the UK's National Cybersecurity Centre, the founding CEO there. Michael McDonald, who's COO of Senseline Health and former Global Director of Deployment at Google Health, and Camilla Rygaard Halstead, who is the CEO of Digital Hub Denmark and a former diplomat to Silicon Valley. So an absolutely brilliant range of experiences to draw on there. And I'd love to turn to Camilla first, because Camilla, I met you last year in Denmark, which now feels like a lifetime away, at the launch of the Digital Hub that you lead. And what really struck me there was that, of course, Denmark is consistently ranked as a top digital nation in terms of government digitalization and the public sector, and also has a thriving, innovative technology sector, and one I know that you're working hard to support even further. So I'd be really curious to hear from you how the two have reinforced each other, are reinforcing each other. I know you have also some slides to share, so perhaps you can answer through some of them, if that's okay.
Thank you very much, Tanya, and thank you for having me. First of all, I love your perspective. Let's not get too depressed about what could go wrong in the digital era, and let's look at good examples. So thank you for having me. Before I look at the slides, I'd like to answer in this way. I think the digitalization over the last, 19, 20 years in Denmark has led, of the public sector, has led Denmark to be one of the easiest countries in the world to do business. And that means it's literally super easy to open up your business in Denmark. At the same time, we're a very small nation, as you know, so the home market is really, really small. And the businesses need, say, the public sector, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs to help them get into new countries and break through new export markets. So the public-private collaboration has been and is very, very strong in our country. It has to do with survival, obviously, to compete in the world. So thank you for putting up my slides. What we use as a slogan here in Digital Hub Denmark is that we do digital differently. So let's look at the slides. Most people don't know, but we've actually been digitized for 19 years now. And so we're one of the public sectors with the most experience in how to digitize and digitalize in the later years thoroughly all over. And I'm going to show you some results of this. Next, please. One result is that we have only one key to unlock all the lovely online self-service solutions for the citizens. For example, 1,600 online self-service solutions for businesses, or Danes as citizens, 2,000 online self-services for the Danes as citizens, or online banking, whatever. Whatever it takes is one key. And this is pretty impressive because in most countries, that's not so simple. Next, please. About 90% of the users are satisfied with this key. We call it NEM ID, which means easy ID. 96% of companies are aware of this and uses it. And also 92% of the users are satisfied when it is a gateway to the public sector. So it's not only that it's there, it's also being used. Next, please. Another thing which is not very well known, and it's my organization's responsibility to make it known, that Unity, Skype, and Google Maps were actually invented in Denmark, or by Danes. And if we take the next one, this is some of the things that we usually say about the essence of entrepreneurship and scalability in Denmark. We tried to find out what exactly is it. I think from childhood, Danes are told to question the status quo, not go with the conventional wisdom, and we are encouraged to find improvements all the time. And so if you think about that, everything is never good enough. And that resembles a little bit Silicon Valley, although we are very far from Silicon Valley because we don't have any of that kind of talent or customers or capital, but we have the essence for entrepreneurship and scalability. Next, please. If we look at what the World Bank says about the ease of doing business, as I just said, we're one of the easiest places doing business, of course, beat by New Zealand, Singapore, and Hong Kong, but number 4 in the world. And the next. When it comes to the willingness to delegate authority, I think it makes a difference. We're actually number 1. There's a very low hierarchy in Danish companies and organizations. With a new person coming into the company, the CEO is never far away. There's an open door policy, and the power distance is really low. The next one, please. When it comes to entrepreneurial ecosystems, the Getty Global Entrepreneurship Index has placed Denmark as number 4. This is of 2019. So beat by United States, Switzerland, and Canada, but number 4 on the global scene. So we do have these coming for us, and I think the digitalization has a lot to do with it, although it's not the only thing. I'll get back to that, Tanya, when we get further in our discussion. So that's my slides, and thank you for inviting me again.
Thank you, Camilla, and thank you in particular for highlighting the cultural dimensions that seem to be so important to this story of Danish innovation. Michael, you have spent a lot of time working in healthcare systems from various different perspectives and sectors, and I would be very curious to hear from you how attitudes to technology innovation have changed, if they've changed or stagnated, in the public healthcare system over the course of your career to date, and what do you think has motivated either some of these changes or areas where actually you think there's still more of a push needed?
Well, thank you for the invitation to be part of the seminar, and I was relieved to see in those slides the United Kingdom doesn't come last in every single one of those lists. We were at least in the middle, so good for us. And so yes, I'm Michael MacDonald. I'm currently at Sensign Health, which is a clinical AI company that works with the NHS to develop repositories of de-identified data that on the one hand allow us to accelerate the development of medicines for working with pharmaceutical and biotech companies. And then on the other hand, to develop digital therapeutics powered by AI that helps improve patient care. Now, I've been there for 5 weeks, so you'll have to take it easy on me in terms of in questions about it. And previously, as you say, I was at Google. And then before that, I was at NHS England, which is the sort of national body that oversees the NHS here in England, responsible for the regulatory matters as well as funding. So I've kind of lived both sides of this, of the divide, and I like this idea that we need to be diplomats across the different sectors. So I thought I would just offer three kind of lessons that I've taken from my time being half in and half out of the government. And so I'm going to dodge your question a little bit, but just give you three lessons. Then you can come back and ask me those same questions and I won't dodge it a second time. The first one is, I think it's so important to actually solve problems rather than just profess solutions. One of the things I see in technology, which has not changed over time, is that the private sector complains about why their wonderful solution is not being taken up by the public sector, and never spends enough time asking, does it actually solve the problem for the users? And in healthcare, that really means working very closely with clinicians, and in both Google and in Sensign and for everything we design is by and for clinicians, and you have to take that really seriously. Otherwise, I don't think you're sort of entitled to complain when people won't see your side of the argument. So although it sounds simple, one of the most important things to do is to really solve problems out there rather than kind of put forward solutions. Secondly, and this is more than what governments need to do. We need to create the conditions for change. And this sounds a little bit like what Denmark's done so well and maybe England has done less well. So in the health service where I work, there's kind of two dimensions to it. On the one hand, there's insufficient investment in some of the basics that we need to make technology take hold. So things like, you know, basic infrastructure, attention to data quality, digital maturity, those sort of things are incredibly important. And, you know, we get fixated on the whizzy stuff and then forget actually that in many of our hospitals here, we still have doctors and nurses entering observations on paper. Well, there's no further technology discussion if that's true. So there's something about kind of creating the basic infrastructure. And that also means a second dimension of making sure we got the right skills, capability, and people to allow technology to take hold. And of course, many people will know that it's not just technology that makes change happen, it's technology plus humans. So, you know, making sure, and again, in the health service, to take my particular lens, making sure that we've got chief clinical information officers that are part of the decision-making team, that CIOs are part of the team, that they're not kind of some side, you know, that digital strategy is not kind of thought. So as my dog is going crazy in the background, she's come in and out of the rain, and when she comes into the rain, she gets very frisky. So you're going to have to put up with this in the background. I promise it's not my wife or one of my children. Anyway, she's really doing her best to distract me. So could create the conditions for change. And then the third thing I'm going to say, and say it quickly so I can go discipline my dog, is to kind of watch out for the hype and instead focus on the long term. So I work in AI. I don't know how many of you do, but AI is kind of classic bit of hype. Before that was big data. There's all these sort of, you can look back and watch these spikes in the hype. And it's one of the, I don't know whoever said this, but we consistently sort of over focus on the short term and underestimate the long term. And I really do think that we'll see that AI does completely change the practice of government and healthcare, but in maybe less overwhelming ways than we imagine. So I think it'll be partnered with doctors and nurses to make better care, not replace them. You know, I think it'll be like when we introduced scanning technologies into medicine. We now wouldn't ever dream of diagnosing a patient without a CT scan or an MRI. And we don't think we don't think that's revolution anymore, but of course it once was. So I do think that we need to take a longer view on technology and don't believe all the hype. So anyway, those are a few thoughts to get us started. And sorry about my growling dachshund.
Thank you, Michael. I think we had a cat join in the last webinar, so it's only appropriate that we have a dog this time. But thank you for setting out some of that longer term vision. And I'll be really curious to hear from Ciaran whether what we've heard so far resonates with cybersecurity and your experience there. And I guess my broader question for you is really thinking about how can governments reap the benefits of technology while still keeping the trust of citizens in public institutions and the technologies that they engage. And maybe I've worded that slightly wrongly, because saying still keep the trust suggests that it's there to start with which perhaps is open for debate as well. Ciaran, over to you.
Thanks, Tanya. It is open for debate, but it's the right question. The question about trust or confidence in technology. I think it's the most important question, one of the most important questions of our time. And I think just firstly to congratulate you and your colleagues on this initiative. I think it's outstanding. It's refreshing. It occupies a necessary space. And why is that? I think that conversations that one can have on the interface between public policy and technology can be about as productive as trying to tell Michael or my dog, who is also threatening outside, to not to interrupt a webinar. I think, you know, technology as a matter of public discourse is so badly understood. If you take 2020, I mean, no one's really talking about the successes of technology in 2020. We've had a terrible year. That's hardly an insight that you asked me to come on to share, but it's been such a difficult year in terms of health of those we love and are concerned about, and health for everybody else, and also economics and life chances and general enjoyment. And technology has more or less safely and competently kept many of us at least partly going professionally and personally in terms of contacts with people at work and at home. And, you know, there's been the odd bit of recognition and understanding. I mean, here in the UK, I was delighted that the Queen's Birthday Honours List honoured some engineers who spent time climbing up poles to keep disconnected areas, get them back online, and really valuable stuff for that, not far off the heroics, not quite on par with some of the heroics of healthcare, but a pretty useful public function and so forth. And when I go back, I think we are in a better place than we were certainly when I started in government cybersecurity. As a generalist, I'm a history graduate, I'm not a techie, but I learned how to talk to techies. But I remember when I made my first public appearance in as head of UK sort of government cybersecurity in 2014, and my team had told me that really we wanted to start simplifying the problem and getting buy-in and being realistic about it and not hyping it up so that people could take useful decisions and so forth. But this was rather scuppered by walking on stage to the video which preceded me, which I hadn't seen, which was a city on fire because it had been attacked in a devastating way. The ATMs weren't working, there were riots in the streets and so forth, and it was this sort of apocalyptic version of technology based on no lived experience at all. Cyber attacks are far more complicated and subtle by and large than that sort of Hollywood nonsense, and yet this was standard discourse. Now I think it's got a bit better, but at the same time, you know, in the recent past, I've talked to senior corporate executives who are having very expensive cybersecurity exercise based on entirely unrealistic scenarios, but just based on hype. And, you know, having discussions with key decision takers across the world where you think, you know, I probably know more relative to you than I should, given that I'm not a technologist. So I think this concept of a digital translator is really important, because the central issue of our time is trust in technology in our space, because, you know, we would have had so many more problems than we already have if in 2020 if technology hadn't stood up to it. So I now think that looking ahead, maintaining and enhancing trust in technology, you can argue, as you say, Tanya, about the baseline, is a public good. So I hope that in building the National Cybersecurity Centre, me and my colleagues played some role in digital translation. So I'll just leave you with a few sort of lessons that I think might help to have that conversation between, you know, technical experts and the wider public, and with decision takers in the middle. I think there is a first part about this, about understanding how technology works at its most basic. One thing I did, I took a week off in 2016 when the NCAC was being set up, and I still can't code, but I had experts teach, you know, undersea cables, data centers. You know, it's all learnable stuff. And just so that you know what happens when an email gets sent, what's the sort of infrastructure in which that depends, and so forth. You know, we expect decision takers to have a basic grasp of law, of economics, of things like public health, of financial liabilities, and that sort of thing. We need to educate people about the basics of technology, even if they're not going to be whizzes. I think we have to help people understand risk. I remember opening a security operations center at a critical national infrastructure plant in the UK, and there was the obligatory very impressive looking map of the world with all these attacks going everywhere. And I talked to the young analyst, said to him, he was very, very good, and said, that thing there where someone in the Kingdom of Jordan is firing at the Republic of Chile, what does that data point signify? And he just giggled and he said, you know, sir, that's just there for the tourists. You know, so you got the state of the art thing and it's just designed to bamboozle people. That's not really what we should be doing. So understanding real risk. A third thing is about countering fear. You mentioned this a bit, there's this sort of dystopian narrative. And I remember going to a presentation about effectively killer robots. And yes, it's true, we can manufacture killer robots. But this whole presentation, and it was to quite senior people, was based on the predication that nobody anywhere in the world, public or private, in any form of human activity would try and interdict any part of the assembly and operationalization of the killer robots. But yet, and so the threat was presented as imminent and real and likely because it hadn't taken into account the range of things that we could do. A fourth thing is to make it simple, to go away from killer robots into something as basic as passwords. When we, and I think we've got a lot to learn from, you know, Camilla and countries like Denmark, when you start to treat people like grown-ups, funnily enough, they behave like them. And when you start to say, look, you know, this, we're not, but we were blaming individuals, you know, don't click on a dodgy link. Well, how did most people know what a dodgy link is? And, you know, people, high functioning individuals didn't suddenly become imbeciles when it came to technology. We just made it too hard for them to use safely. And then finally, we do have to make it beneficial, but not in an all consuming way. I think Camilla used the phrase good enough. You just have to make things good enough. They don't have to be perfect for most things and so on. So those would be the sort of 5 things that I would try: understanding how it works, understanding risk, countering fear, making it simple, and making it beneficial. So if we get there, that's where I think you know, trust comes from. That, and I would say that I think we need to make some of the debates about technology a bit more accessible in that respect. I mean, for example, there's quite a large scale but specialist discussion going on about algorithmic bias. And of course, that's an important issue, but I think sometimes we allow it to just dominate. I mean, algorithmic bias is not the only issue, even in AI. I mean, algorithmic security is quite a significant issue. There's not nearly as much about that. And they can be quite exclusive, these conversations, and people, there is still a culture, to go back to that point about culture, there's still a culture that you're not really allowed to venture into these conversations if you're not a technologist, or in Europe, if you're not a technologist or a lawyer. Well, actually, that's no way to run these conversations. Everybody's going to be using these things and everybody's going to be impacted on them. So there should be no qualifications to entering the conversation, and there should be an assumption of simplicity within them.
Thank you, Ciaran, for sharing that really interesting perspective. I think that point about, you know, policymakers potentially gaining enough technology understanding and trying to work out what enough looks like for different roles around different technologies is really, really critical. And I'd love to loop back to the question about capabilities in a moment. I do just want to ask each of you, though, first of all, about some of the challenges and opportunities you perceive around public-private technology partnerships. You know, whether that's for the sectors themselves, for citizens, but also I'd be curious to hear from you on an individual level, how public-private relationships and partnerships have shaped your careers. I think there's a lot of discussion of them at the moment around technology and health-related technology needs, not least. So I'd love to hear a bit about those challenges and opportunities. Michael, maybe we could start with you on that one.
Sure. Yeah. No, as you say, I've probably been in one form or the other, formal or less formal, and public-private partnerships for much of my career. And I'd say, look, the opportunities are vast. I mean, the thing about the reason to do them is because government isn't good at everything, and neither is the private sector. It's a symbiosis that you want to strike, where, you know, for instance, if you're seeking, you know, AI skills or data scientist skills, it's, you know, they happen to be in some private sector organizations or in universities. And so you want to collaborate with them rather than trying to replicate them and being unrealistic about the government's ability to recruit them. So I think there are certainly kind of big opportunities. There are also challenges. There's no question about that. I think there's always been, at least in this country, and it probably is a bit different in different countries. I'd be interested to know what it's like in Denmark, but a sort of suspicion that it is political in part in nature, that's you know, at its crudest, sort of the public sector is good and the private sector is bad. Obviously, that's, you know, that's a sort of silly way of seeing the world. But I do think that the less silly way of seeing it is we don't always get the kind of incentives right. We don't always remember that success for a government, success for the NHS is a very different thing than success for a private sector firm. And we should be, you know, kind of clear-eyed about that, and also protect each other from, you know, sort of misunderstandings in that way. So there's no question those sort of cultural and political differences cause a challenge.
Thank you. Camilla, you've really carved a career at this intersection and thought a lot about how to make the sectors work best together. In your experience, what are some of the challenges and opportunities, and how do you align incentives?
So when I read this, I thought, okay, challenges. One of the biggest challenges that I see in our system, which has come very far, is that the public sector can be too slow, simply. The public sector wants to look at the whole of the country. So if we're doing something in the eastern part of the country, what are we doing in the western? If we're taking care of the wealthy municipalities, what about those who are less wealthy, etc.? And the startups, especially the tech startups, they just don't have the patience, right? They need the capital, they need the talent now, they need the customers, they need to get out and do something. So the challenge is that there's a lag time between how fast the government can go, even though it's agile compared to other countries and well digitized, and what is needed by the spearheading tech startups. So that's a huge challenge. And my organization, which is a public-private partnership, is trying to mitigate that, to be more on the side of the private sector and help the tech companies actually get there. Opportunities, there are plenty, and we just heard a lot of them. Opportunities are like, try to get the most efficient healthcare system in the world. If you used your data, if you trained the algorithms, if you tried and using everything you have in your country. It could be your taxation system. I can tell you from living abroad in Silicon Valley, it is so much easier to file your taxes in Denmark compared to the US. Entrepreneurial system. We have subsidized incubators and accelerators in most major cities in the country. Risk mitigation, when we have a crisis like Corona, the authorities will work immediately to try to give aid, etc., and help, because of course it's an economic crisis as well. So we have enormous amount of health data from having been digitized for so long, and we're trying to get access to it in the right way, so we're not breaking confidentiality, but at the same time are able to work with the statistical measures of these data to try and improve, of course, drug discovery, etc. So there's a lot of opportunities where the public sector sort of takes a lead, but the whole point in having a public sector, which is such a professional body, is to enhance the private sector. So they shouldn't mock each other. They live together. It's the symbiosis, as we just heard.
Ciaran, how do the public and private sectors live together, in Camilla's words, when it comes to cybersecurity? What's the state of the ecosystem in the UK and perhaps more broadly?
Well, this is a great discussion for two reasons. One is, you know, people are talking about massive opportunities and so forth, which you don't normally get when you're talking about my gloomy field. And secondly, as part of my work at the School of Government at Oxford, I'm trying to develop a course on how to use the private sector well. So I've just been taking notes from Michael and Camilla's really good points. I think there is something on the private sector side about recognizing the different pressures on government. You know, the number of times in my quarter of a century in the civil service in the UK where, you know, I would hear a government purchaser talk to a private sector provider saying, well, I didn't mean you to do that. And of course, the private sector person will produce the contract that says exactly what you should do. But things like in tech, say, you know, governments by and large will be more vulnerable and will care more about where the data center is, if it's got the personal data of citizens and so forth. And it took us years to figure that out. And in parts of Europe, there have been big scandals about that in the relatively recent past. So I think, you know, and also I'm very sympathetic to Camilla's point about, what happens in the east and the west in the country, but unlike a commercial organization, the government's not really allowed to develop something that works for 90% of the people and exclude the hardest to reach 10% in the way that a commercial organization is. So they're just basic things like that in terms of mutual understanding. In cybersecurity, I think it's quite interesting. Again, when I started in this field about 7 years ago, there was your classic, stifling of innovation in many ways. It was your classic no one ever lost a job for giving the contract to IBM type of culture. And also there was a sense, and I'm not having a go at IBM, I'm just talking about the general culture at the time. There was that sort of culture of presenting fear. This is a big, bad, incomprehensible problem, and all you need to do is buy our PowerPoint deck and we'll take care of it, and you can persuade the board. And that was bad for cybersecurity. It was bad for innovation. It was just bad all around. I hope we've made some progress, particularly not just in opening it up to smaller points, but I think it comes back to something Michael said, which is just fix a problem. Take a bit of the problem set, present it, explain it well. It took me about 2-3 years to do this, but I ended up, when I was talking to entrepreneurs and startups, it was, I learned to just ask, but what does your product or service actually do? You get through all of this, but what does it do? And what does it do that something else doesn't do? And when you start to do that, we did some really fantastic stuff at the NCSC where small companies automated takedown requests for known dodgy websites, and the UK's share of malicious website hosting tumbled from about 5.5% to about 2% in a couple of years. And that was done by just paying a relatively small amount of money to a really innovative private sector company. And now other people copied it, and there's a market going in that stuff, and that's great. So there is some good practice there, and I would share the excitement if we get it right. But government needs to be a bit smarter, and we all have to do as much as we can to constrain the sort of bubble tendency of these things, where you just get bamboozled with attractive sounding things, but they don't actually do anything.
Thanks, Ciaran. I think that point about what big problem are you trying to contribute to solving is definitely one for lots of entrepreneurs to be thinking about, and think about how to articulate as well to the policymaker audience. We actually have a related question to that. I don't know if Eleanor Willock is there, because it strikes me that her question is a good follow-up there for Ciaran. Eleanor, are you able to ask your question? You're there?
Yeah, I do. Hiya. Can you hear me?
Yes, yeah.
Hello, everyone. Hi. Yeah, you've actually answered it really, Ciaran. Kind of. I was really, my constant issue, the part of this industry that I work in is communications. And when our clients are mostly small and medium-sized tech companies, and the biggest issue we predominantly face for them is getting in front of senior policymakers and decision makers, where the larger, as I say, Deloitte, Capita, AWS, IBM, all the usual suspects would be. And I sometimes think that the general public only hears, as you said, about the huge mistakes, especially when it comes to IT. You only hear of the companies getting the blame. You never hear of the good stuff. And I wondered if you felt that technology's reputation would be improved if there was a better level of information coming out of the civil service regarding this.
Broadly, yes. Firstly, I'll be brief. Firstly, I sympathise. I recognise the problem that you've got, and also getting senior attention. I mean, there are ways of doing it, but it can be quite hard and very frustrating. Secondly, I do think there is a big thing around transparency and clear, and not just transparency in terms of a willingness to open up, but the way you do it and the way you explain it. I mean, for example, I think Tanya in the introduction mentioned discussions about the app. I mean, about the contact tracing apps and so forth. I mean, some of the stuff I saw, and again, I speak as a generalist about the situation in other countries. I mean, I think the debate in the UK was quite healthy. It's an open society, but some of the characterization of what was happening in other countries was just a bit absurd. I mean, you know, the Republic of South Korea can do it this way, as if it was done by a contract tracing app rather than by highly intrusive data matching of financial records and debit cards and nightclubs and that sort of thing, which is perfectly doable in the UK, but it's just not the sort of general approach to data privacy that we approach. Have that conversation. We haven't really had a conversation about you know, it says that we hear that contract tracing apps are being used in their millions all across other countries, but no real debate about whether they've been effective or not, and so forth, or indeed the displacement activity of lots of QR codes going around. And I think, you know, if you have that conversation, I think governments are discouraged from having it because it feels quite risky, and I understand that. You know, governments can be risk-averse places for understandable reasons, but if you get over that, you can have a more honest conversation that buys in people, even if parts of the discussion are uncomfortable for governments. Of course, it's easy for me to say that now, having left.
Thank you, Ciaran. Michael, I'd be curious to hear your perspective as well on this one, having just moved to a startup of sorts. Is it too soon to ask you about potentially some of the shifts in experience from moving from a very large player to a somewhat smaller one?
Sure, yeah. Well, it's got all the things you'd expect in the sort of difference in pace and resources and so forth, but I do certainly recognize the I mean, the question sort of points, you know, like the Googles of the world can get into those rooms and have high-paid staff, and, you know, moving those, so get invited to Downing Street, all those sort of things, and the rest, and startups don't. I would say, and look, that's a hard problem to solve, and you know, relationships being what they are, and you know, there's not an immediate solution to. All I would say is there can be a fetishization of the kind of senior level discussions, as though they're the only way to get something done, or they're the only people who decide things, or that they know all the answers. And I do think that, you know, public sector, like many other sectors, is very distributed, and certainly in the healthcare, I spend more of my time now with NHS hospitals, you know, or universities, and much less of my time, you know, around Whitehall, and that's fine, and they make the different decisions. And so you got to kind of recognize there's a sort of plurality in these systems, I think, and, you know, there are kind of ups and downs of being big or small.
Thank you. I think it will be interesting to invite you back in a year or so and to hear any changes in your perspective on that one. I know we have Andrew Bennett here from the Tony Blair Institute, and I'd love to bring him into the conversation because I know he's done a lot of thinking about this intersection between government and technology. So Andrew, are you there?
Hi, Tanya. Yes,
Hi.
Thanks for the panel. It's been a really interesting discussion. One thing that I just wanted to pick up on is whether, just to sort of unpack what digital translation really is it really about helping leaders understand sort of what levers they have at their disposal and what it means to pull them and how they can best do so? And I sort of asked this because we've heard a few stories recently about civil service reform where Minister X has pulled lever and nothing has happened. And it sort of implies this very mechanistic sort of approach to governance. And actually, that's not necessarily how the system works. And broadly, if you think of the different levers that kind of governments have, whether it's tax and spend, regulation, education, and then there's this big chunk of delivery. And we sort of understand the first three, but maybe the leaders don't necessarily understand the latter. And I guess that's my question, which is, you know, are we really asking sort of ambiguous questions of the civil service, and we need that sort of large S to soak up the ambiguity and work out how policy should work, because all we're doing is describing an end state that we'd like to see? And could digital translation really be about asking better questions of the machinery of the state?
Camilla, I'd love to turn to you first, because perhaps some might say that Denmark is a little further along in this journey. What's the experience been of that in Denmark?
Yes, I wouldn't want you all to think that we are all perfect, right? At some point 2 years ago, our government decided to have a special task force to disrupt themselves. So they had 4 or 5 entrepreneurs come into the Ministry of Business and give them advice on how to mitigate that gap that we've been discussing today. And it hasn't been all easy, but lots of products came out of that. How can we be better at listening to what's the problem rather than to solve something we think we can solve? How can we be better at understanding what the citizens want? How can we do things faster, smoother, and more agile? How can we get out of the box and think differently? And I think that actually, most of all, instigated a mindset shift, which is really needed. Also, on the practical level, there will be, 10 or 20 projects that were rolled out and maybe to some success. However, I think it's the mindset change, and it's very brave of obviously a relatively conservative regulatory body to say disrupt me, and I'm trying to take it in. So it's also, so when we've had success, it's also because at some point there was no more success to be had, and then what next? And that was, okay, let's get a task force to disrupt us. So this is just one example.
Ciaran, any responses to Andrew's comment?
Well, I agree with Camilla. I think I also agree with Andrew's last part of his question about framing the questions in the right way is really important. And I think whilst they're 2 negative words, I think it's worth thinking about concepts of risk and concepts of harm. So I think, one thing that bureaucracies find quite difficult is failure. And I don't mean sort of startup failure where, you have 2 or 3 goes and then the 4th time you succeed. I mean, if you take something like data sharing for better public services, it tends to be pendulum based. So there's a big opportunity phase, which is, we need to match up all these data so that citizens have one interaction with government, then there tends to be some sort of mistake or security breach and so forth, and everything's locked down again and so on. And I think, again, something we're trying to do in cybersecurity is, look, not laugh off, but, shrug off my less serious breaches. If overall you're going in the right direction and you're enabling things, then not everything matters. I was on the board of GCHQ for 6.5 years, and a group of hacktivists took down the public-facing website. The public-facing website was 20 pages of introductory material. There was no interaction, no data, nothing on it. So we just sort of shrugged it off and said, look, it would cost far too much taxpayers' money to defend this against this sort of thing. It's not very disruptive. It was back up in 3 hours. All the things are much better protected. And having grown up discussions about risk, similarly about harm, we terrify people when we announce data breaches of 150 million personal records. Well, 150 million personal records that are a name and email address and the last 4 digits of a credit card are useful on the criminal market, but the 150 million people aren't at any real direct personal risk. 150,000 people, let's say security clearance forms or mortgage application forms with huge amounts of personal data, including secondary identifiers like mother's maiden names and favorite pets and so on. That's far more damaging. But we don't have that sophisticated, it's not even that sophisticated. We don't have that sort of just transparent conversation about risk and harm, about the negatives as well as the positives. And I think we do because, we're long past the stage of protecting everything. We're just where we are in the stage of protecting at all costs what we need most, and protecting everything else as well as we can. And if we have that sort of honest conversation about risk and harm, then security as the enabling function, or as an enabling function for everything else, becomes an enabler for a better service to citizens rather than an impediment of it.
Thank you, Ciaran. I'm curious to hear Michael's perspective on this one as well, especially around the conversations around harm and risk in relation to health technologies.
Yeah, well, actually, I think, and I'm scared to hear that Ciaran says the favorite pet is a giveaway. So I'm glad I didn't tell you my Dachshund's name, but so I'm safe here. But I think that behind Andrew's question is not really one mainly about technology. I agree. I was in Tony's delivery unit way back when, and I think we are learning after the pandemic that the need to rebuild the capability of the state to deliver well is going to become a public priority for us. But I don't think that that is mainly about technology. I think it's mainly about, you know, making sure we've got clear objectives, making sure there's real accountability, building delivery skills into the civil service, making sure resources follow those delivery skills and those objectives. You know, some of the basics of statecraft that I feel are being lost, and you know, that kind of we used to have the idea of a civil service as distinct from a political tier to get stuff done, but you really do need to you know, nurture and build those sort of capabilities. And part of it will be technology, but the much more important part, I think, is basic deliverology, as Michael Barber might have said.
Thanks, Michael. Our time is coming to a close fairly soon. So what I'm going to do is try to draw on a couple of questions that have been put into the chat and ask you a kind of final question in synthesis of them. So Annabelle Manley has asked about what happens on the ground. So how can we encourage an innovative civil service at every level? So high-level governance used to encourage take-up of good applications of new technologies on the ground level, especially when there's pressure, limited capacity potentially for the training required. And I think that's a really, really interesting point. And I'd love to hear answers to that while thinking about essentially what those capabilities needs are and how we go about nurturing them. I'd be curious to hear, you know, is there a role for universities in that? I personally would like to think so. So what are those capabilities? Where do we go about nurturing them? And what's the role of senior policymakers in encouraging some of this take up at the ground level? So as I say, an amalgamation of questions there. And I am curious to hear your perspectives. Camilla, any thoughts on that one?
So yes, when it comes to universities, at least what I have observed here in Denmark is that we're very, very good at getting the expert level right. We are less good at teaching leadership skills. So I think we can include that in your question. It's not just about getting capabilities in terms of you know, professional pockets where we have no education. It's also about making the right decisions. And I understand we are talking about on the lowest level, but I still think we are not educating digital leaders very well, at least not in my country. So I would start there. And then when it comes to continued studies, yes, universities all over the globe should do this right now. We need everybody educated, but civil servants, yeah, absolutely.
Thank you. Michael, over to you.
Yeah, I would agree with all that. I guess the other observation I'd make is, at least in healthcare, the sort of presumption that digital skills aren't there is wrong. You need to find them. And I think you can, you know, like in every hospital I've ever worked with, there are, you know, young and old, you know, doctors and nurses who, just like us, you know, use Google Maps, or, you know, are coding in their spare time, or are boning up on cybersecurity. And we need to do more to champion them and engage them in the leadership of their organizations, and you know, stop being so hierarchical about how some of these organizations are constructed. So I think the job is less to develop them. I think it's almost to reward, incentivize, and recognize those that can play a bigger role in public sector organizations.
Thank you, Michael. Ciaran, having just joined a university fairly recently, do they have a role to play in this story? Where do you see the future of public service capabilities being built?
Well, firstly, I agree very strongly with Michael's last point. In areas like healthcare, there is a huge amount of expertise, and it's easy to rubbish it, but it's extremely counterproductive. On the role of universities, I think there are two roles. One, is I think leaders need to understand technology, and everybody knows now it's as essential as understanding basic science, basic law, economics. It's an essential part of learning public administration. So that's one thing that universities can help with. I think a second thing that universities can help with is acting as that interface between really deep technological experts and people who have to apply this, be they lawyers, regulators, or people, academics who specialize in law and regulation and so forth. And it's an easy and collaborative space in which to do that. So like you, obviously declaring personal interest as you did, I think there is a role to play. And I know we're out of time, but I can't resist. Lawrence made a very good point in the chat about why is good enough okay when we're taught to present the best. I think that's relevant to this. And I was coming at it from a security point of view. Security should never be an objective in and of itself, really. It should be just enabling something else. And I think if leaders are taught and learn good sort of understanding of a basic sort of digital dialogue, then they just say, right, this is a risk balance judgment for our country, and we'll do it this way, and that's good public policy.
Thank you, Ciaran. I put in the chat a link to an organisation that I'm part of, which is called Teaching Public Service in a Digital Age. And one of the things we're really thinking about is how you integrate digital skills into a broader public policy curriculum. So for our future and emerging policy leaders to have that level of skill in order to be conversant around some of these debates. So do have a look at that if that's of interest to you. But I very much agree with the points that have been made about that need to upskill at every level of government, including, I would add, political leadership. I think sometimes they're kind of absented from the picture, but thinking about our MPs, parliamentarians, I think they're very much part of this picture as well. Our time is drawing to a close, so I do want to thank all of our speakers for their very interesting insights. And I think it's been wonderful to hear these perspectives from cyber, from health, from innovation, drawn together to give us a broad overview of life at the intersection of government and technology in each of these areas, and to hear about some of the overlaps and perhaps some of the areas where there are differences also. And I really look forward to continuing to foster these kinds of conversations. I do just want to make you aware of our next webinar in the series, which will take place in November. And that webinar is going to have a regional focus on Latin America. And we're going to think about how to reimagine public services in Latin America. We will have our partner organization for that webinar, which is UNIT, which has a lot of experience working both in the public sector and private sector, and is a design agency. So it's going to bring that perspective as we try to think about how we might reimagine public services there. So if you are interested in Latin America in particular, but equally, if you would like to be inspired by ideas from that region, then please do join that next event. There's already a link to it in the chat for you on 24th November. So please do join me in thanking our speakers for their participation this evening. Thanks to all of you for your comments and questions and attention. And I wish you a very good evening. Thank you.